Hello, and welcome to another question and answer session, another members' question and answer session of David Starkey Talks. The question that I want to deal with today comes from Brink Bush, and it goes as follows. Did English monarchs always have the power to kill anyone they desired to eliminate? And with which monarch did this power end? Well, Brink, that is a very typical misunderstanding. Indeed, it is a complete misunderstanding. English monarchs, at any rate from the very earliest periods onwards, never claimed such powers and didn't have them. So why do we think they did? Well, I suppose it's pretty much the reign of Henry VIII, and indeed the carelessness of many historians that leads people to think this. I mean, how often do you read or hear this sort of sentence? Henry VIII ordered so-and-so and so-and-so to be executed. He couldn't, and he didn't. He could order their trial by some means or another. But that was a difficult, expensive, contentious, and often risky process. In other words, there was actually a possibility that people might get off, even, with George Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's brother. There is betting during the trial. He was mounting such a good defence to what by and large were the absurd charges against him that people thought, gosh, he might just actually get off. He didn't, but the possibility was there. So they don't have this power, and by and large they don't do it. In other words, execute without trial. Now, there are some exceptions. The big exception, and it will surprise none of you that this be the case, at least none of you who are sane that this be the case, is of course Richard III, or rather Richard Duke of Gloucester. One of the things that was held against him, not simply the murder of the princes in the Tower, where again, of course, there clearly is no form of justice, but was a case that was public knowledge and was performed in the full light of day, and as such appears as a conspicuous incident in Shakespeare's play. And that is, whilst he is still Duke of Gloucester, whilst he is still moving to seize the throne when he is Lord Protector, he has who? He has Lord Hastings literally dragged from the council table in the Tower to instant execution on a log of wood, his head resting on a log of wood outside. Now, that shocked. That shocked because kings didn't, and on the whole, shouldn't do it. Another king who pushes the rules pretty far, actually, is Richard's brother, Edward IV. Edward IV, by and large amongst his subjects, has got as good a reputation as Richard III, very quickly acquired a bad one. But he too had a tendency to push things to the limit. Again, look why. He comes to the throne as a teenager across the bodies of his father and his elder brother, in a time when the strife of the Wars of the Roses was at its bitterest and bloodiest. And indeed, it is in battle that the rules are suspended. If you take arms against the king or somebody who claims to be king, remember, this is, of course, the device that is used by Henry, Earl of Richmond at the Battle of Bosworth. Henry, when he wins the battle, he's crowned on the battlefield with the circlet, the battle crown, taken from Richard III's helmet, found clearly, the legend is right, in a hawthorn bush. What he does after that moment of coronation, he dates his reign, battlefield coronation, he dates his reign from the day before the battle, which means, of course, that, well, everybody who fought against him was a traitor. And the Croyland Chronicler, this extraordinary inside job, or Croyland Continuator rather, this extraordinary inside job chronicle by somebody very distinguished within the purlieus of government, though alas we don't know who it is and probably never will, comments on the deplorable nature of this deceit. But in any case, setting aside that kind of trick, when a battle is fought, when you go with banners displayed against the king, the ordinary rules of justice, the ordinary rules of law are suspended. And you become, we still do it. We talk about martial law, and martial law meant, of course, that somebody who is captured fighting against the king could be killed instantly if the king or other commanders so decided, or indeed that you could pursue fugitives, though this was more debatable, you could pursue fugitives after the battle. And the most famous incident of this is after the Battle of Tewkesbury, fought in 1471, perhaps the not as big or on as large a scale as Towton, but in some ways the most terrible of the battles of the Civil War, the battles of the Wars of the Roses, for the simple reason that Edward IV, deciding that mercy was pointless, that mercy was destructive, decided to use the battle to kill, as the chronicler Warkworth says, anybody with a drop of Lancastrian blood that he could find. And the murder continues up to the steps of the altar in Tewkesbury Abbey, and it is supposed to be stopped only by a priest actually raising the host, raising the reserved sacrament, and the abbey had to be reconsecrated and cleaned from the horror. So that is execution in the aftermath of battle under effectively martial law. It had also been used earlier in the first half of Edward's reign when his Lord High Constable, a man called John Tiptoft, exercised the power of High Constable through the court of the High Constable to impose martial law outside English common law. Again and again regarded as being profoundly controversial and led to his own very unpleasant demise the moment people had the opportunity to do it. Because, let's be quite clear, English law, English common law, required some form of process. The king, the crown, anybody else, an opposition group, couldn't simply order an execution, procure an execution, or more particularly, seize property, family property, without some form of law. Now, we get confused on this one. We confuse law and legalism. What I'm talking about is an intense sense of legalism. The English were profoundly legalistic. Now, this does not mean, by the way, that they were particularly interested in the abstract concept of justice. Following the letter of the law and justice are two very, very different things. But what this legalism means is you don't do what was regular continental practice, which was simply to murder people. Or in Scotland, where it's actually institutionalised and formalised. We all hear, for example, about the murder of David Rizzio, Mary Queen of Scots' secretary. Actually, it was a result, it wasn't just a casual mob assault, as the poor man is dragged from the Queen's presence and stabbed multiple times. It's the product of a formal agreement. It's called a murder bond, and the lords opposed to him, including the Queen's husband, Henry Darnley, enter into an agreement to murder him, which is why each one of them has got to shove a dagger in, so as they all assume responsibility for the deed. This is a kind of barbarous proceeding, unthinkable in England, because England is, a very early period, a law-bound country. But again, as I said, we mustn't confuse this with notions of abstract justice. For example, we have a kind of running report by one of the judges in his yearbook, his notes, on the notable cases of the year, on the trial of Anne Boleyn. And you can practically hear the sucking of the judicial teeth. All the evidence against her was just a load of bawdry, just gossip and pop. Did he protest against the verdict. Well, actually, yes, he did protest, and so did the rest of the judges protest against the verdict. But they didn't protest, even though they knew, because they're experienced judges, that the evidence is poppycock and balderdash and whatever. They didn't protest against the verdict of guilty. That wasn't their job. What they did protest against was the sentence, because the sentence was what was called disjunctive. It was a sentence declared, and we'll talk about his role there, by Anne Boleyn's uncle, by the Duke of Norfolk, sitting in his capacity as Lord High Steward and presiding over the court, which condemned her to death, but left the method of execution to be either what the law required for a female traitor. We all know, of course, what the law required for a male traitor, the full horror of hanging, drawing and quartering. In other words, you were dragged to the place of execution upon a hurdle, then you are half hanged, and then you are cut down and you are stripped, and you begin by severing the whole of the private parts, which are then burned in front of your face, and then the belly is laid open and your bowels are extracted and also burned, and it could go on exactly as long as the execution was instructed, but it obviously could only be done to a man. Decency required, and presumably absence in those benighted times. There were no women with penises in the 16th century. The absence those benighted times before the transsexual revolution had happened, women were given a different method of execution. They were subject to the equally terrible fate of being burned alive. So Anne Boleyn was condemned, as the law required, the law of treason required, to be burned alive or to be beheaded at the king's discretion. And the judges murmur at that because that's beyond the law. That's not what the law says. The king could commute a sentence, but by an act of mercy. There was no need, and indeed it was illegal or extra legal, to spell it out in the verdict of the court. So that's what I mean by this intense legalism. They know the trial's rigged, but probably expected it. They acknowledge it even in the yearbook, but what they object to formally is the breach of formal legal process. Right, so let's just go back then. So because there are these very strict rules, what you do is you devise various methods and processes to legitimate the removal. I mean, again, Brink is of course right. You want to eliminate somebody because they've become politically inconvenient, they're a rival, and of course the king's subjects can wish to eliminate the king's ministers also, and you have, depending on time and circumstance and what you want to do, you've got different ways of doing it. We can list them. There's one, of course, which still famously survives. Indeed, it was practiced most recently against the former American president, against the Orange Man, which is impeachment. Impeachment, which in America is carried out by the House of Representatives conducting a case in the upper house, the Senate, begins in England, where again the fact that the American legislature is a very, very lightly dressed up version of the English Parliament of the 18th century, the process which does begin with the good Parliament of 1376, with the first impeachment against the minister, the very end of Edward III's reign, against Lord Latimer. It's called impeachment, and what it involves is the lower house, the House of Commons, mounting a case, usually against a royal minister, in the House of Lords, and it reflects the fact, of course, there is no such thing as a separation of powers in England. The Parliament is itself also the High Court. It is the final court of justice, as well as the legislature. And so impeachment is then a regular process by which the subject or the factions amongst the king's subjects can move against a powerful royal minister by this quasi-judicial process in which the legislature actually arrives at a verdict. With the, as I said, the lower house acting as prosecutor and the upper house acting as judge. And it was primarily, and indeed exclusively until I think the 17th century, used only against members of the House of Lords, who at that point were, again, the king's ministers were almost always drawn from the Lords. So that process is famously used, for example, against the leading minister of Charles I, against Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, in which the prosecution is mounted by the leader of the House of Commons, the man who seizes control of the Long Parliament, John Pym, and mounts this magnificent attack on Strafford, to which Strafford responds with equal force and dignity and much better evidence. The result is that impeachment is abandoned, and instead another form of legal quasi-trial is used, and that is what's called the Act of Attainder. And the Act of Attainder very much takes over from impeachment, from, again, you're talking about the dividing point of the reign of Edward IV. That's also a dividing point in terms of prosecutions for treason and the device that's used to deal with them. And it's called the Act of Attainder. This is a straightforward Act of Parliament. In other words, it's a bill which is read in both houses, which condemns somebody. It usually states the reasons, obviously generally speaking in highly propagandistic terms, and it then condemns them as a traitor and orders the sequestration, the confiscation of their property, and the disables their heirs to inherit that property. So when, as I said, the attempt at convicting Strafford fails by impeachment, he's then condemned by Act of Attainder. There is a little problem with the Act of Attainder which isn't true of impeachment. Impeachment doesn't require the agreement of the king, which is why, you could actually use it against the Orange Man. Otherwise, a president would have to agree to his own impeachment, which not even the most law-abiding, let alone the least law-abiding presidents would be likely to do. But attainder is different. Attainder is an ordinary act of Parliament, doing an extraordinary thing, of course, and as an act of Parliament, it requires that threefold assent. Both houses, the Lords and the Commons, have to agree to it, but it is only given effect when it is signed by the sovereign with the declaration "Le roi, la reine, le veut," the monarch wills it. And of course, the question was with Strafford, would Charles I will the execution of his own leading counsellor? Well, eventually he did. He never forgave himself for doing it. He never forgave himself for the resulting execution of Strafford, and he regarded his own voyage to the scaffold as a kind of divine punishment for his treachery, for his cowardice, for his final lack of moral courage. And I think that much of Charles's extraordinary demeanour on the scaffold, that semi-sacrificial behaviour, but combined with a high religious dignity, is a response to the fact that he pondered the issues involved in the execution of Strafford so thoroughly that he was fully, as it were, primed for his own execution, what it entailed, and how he had to deal with it. Now, that of course does raise another very interesting question. Let's have a little byroad here, which is that although clearly the regular method of disposing of an ex-king is simply by murder, as with, and usually very unpleasantly, we are told, as with Edward II, and possibly the famous case of the hot poker, the red hot poker, with Henry VI, with the blow to the back of the head in the Tower, allegedly and quite likely administered by the Duke of Gloucester, with Richard III himself done to death on the battlefield at Bosworth and so on. That's the normal method of dealing with it. But again, when there are circumstances where it's not battle, there isn't a battle being fought, even in the case of removal of a king, there's that sense there ought to be a form of trial. And it's done first. We always forget this. It's done first not with Charles I himself. It is done with Richard II and the Lancastrian usurpation, when there is a form of effectively parliamentary trial, with Richard, part of the time, brought effectively to answer in person. It's an extraordinary moment. And of course, there is that linking case of the trial of Mary Queen of Scots. Again, a formal trial before the usual commission of I think it was the Court of Weigh and Telmine, which we will talk about again at Fotheringhay. She's subject, although she is a crowned sovereign, crowned and anointed sovereign, she is subject to the process of ordinary trial, despite the profound doubts of Elizabeth I, and Elizabeth making perfectly clear she would much prefer to have had her murdered quietly and disposed of, quietly got out of the way, but her subjects, led particularly by Lord Burleigh, by William Cecil, refused to do it. And the device of a formal trial is extorted from the Queen. It's and the warrant to execute her is finally extorted from her also. In other words, the formal procedures are conducted even with a queen, as of course they were, generally speaking, with the Queen, well, not generally speaking, as of course they were with the queens of Henry VIII. And it's worth talking a little bit about that now, because it takes us into the other forms used. So what we've talked about so far is impeachment, which is a trial before the House of Lords, an act of attainder, which develops from the reign of Edward IV onwards, which is condemnation by actually a legislative instrument, by parliamentary statute. Now, impeachment to attainder represents, by and large, the fact that from the reign of Edward IV to the beginning of the 17th century, the process of politics is controlled by the Crown. In other words, what the Crown is doing is wanting to get rid of ministers or wanting to get rid of opponents as a result of their having fallen out of favour, taking the wrong side in religion or whatever. But it's a political scene, it's a political process which is very, very much controlled by the monarch. The dominance of impeachment, on the other hand, from the 14th century through the 15th century, and again with the revival of impeachment in the reign of James I, tells a different story. This is members of the governing class, factions of the governing class, turning against the king and his ministers. So impeachment is a process against the crown, deploying charges of treason against the crown and its ministers, and an act of attainder is a process by which the crown removes, exactly as Brink says, people that the monarch desired to eliminate for whatever political reason it be. So, but they are the parliamentary methods. There are more usual methods, and the more usual methods take the form of special judicial commissions. The normal way that you will deal with charges of treason from the end of the 15th century onwards is by a special. Generally speaking, it could be tried in King's Bench, the ordinary criminal court, but the usual way that it's done is by a special commission, which is what is known as a commission of Weigh and Telmine, to hear and to determine. And these commissions normally consisted of two groups of people. They consist of privy councillors, leading members of the council, who are, of course, they will have investigated the case, so they're acting as judge and jury, and indeed investigating magistrate as well, but reinforced by members of the judiciary, normally the two chief justices of King's Bench and Common Pleas, and so on, are added to the court. And the issuing of one of these special commissions is an indication that something is happening. Again, the issue of the special commission in early 1536 is the signal of motions against Anne Boleyn, and it is that which is used against most of the gentlemen who are prosecuted and condemned with her. But there's a little trick here. Vae and telmine is not usually used against members of the aristocracy. Members of the aristocracy are subject to a special procedure, which is the court of the Lord High Steward. Now, its composition is a jury of peers, or judge and jury. They sit both as judge and jury. So it will be a panel of peers, again, with expert advice there from the judges, presided over by the Lord High Steward for the day, who is usually the senior peer, very often the Duke of Norfolk in this period, who thus finds himself sitting over the trial of nieces and whatever. And the way that works is that the most junior member, God, what a responsibility, the most junior member of the panel, the most junior peer present, that's the one most junior in rank and junior in years that he's held the title, has to go first. So obviously there's this enormous pressure. So that really, Brink, is why kings don't have the power, but generally speaking don't need it. There is a political process which is developed, which by and large, but with a lot of effort, a lot of expense, a lot of political capital, a lot of risk, will remove opponents. You can also see, of course, that this profound respect for law, this profound respect for legalism, does help to limit the bloodiness of politics. Yes, politics is bloody, but it's done according to very strict rules. And you can see fairly clearly, I think, how as we shift from the late 17th century to the beginning of the 18th century, the full bloodiness of this process diminishes, and it becomes possible to remove a minister without actually executing them. But above all, what I want to go back to, I want to reiterate, the foundations of this process are laid precisely in this extraordinarily bloody period of English politics, when nevertheless there is the absolute firm rule, only broken conspicuously by Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and less conspicuously by Edward IV, that the law, the literal law, the formal legal practice must be respected. And this seems to me to be fundamental. If you actually have a rule of law in the sense of respect for legal process, well, justice in our more modern sense, it can come along later, and it's got secure foundations.